5 minutes. That was the price of my sudden exile. The brass of the doorknob was ice cold under my palm, mocking the exact key that now refused to turn. I had just survived a grueling 14-hour overnight shift at the medical supply warehouse, my bones aching, rushing home to the family I bled for. I knocked, a soft, pathetic plea. Footsteps dragged across the hardwood inside, slow, deliberate. "You're late." My brother's voice slid through the cheap wood, utterly devoid of warmth. "Overtime," I breathed, forcing a tired laugh that died in my dry throat. "Supervisor kept me." Silence. Then came the sharp, poisoned velvet of my sister Eleanor's voice. "Let her taste the hallway tonight. A little cold might teach her some discipline." I waited for the punchline. I waited for the deadbolt to click open. Instead, the television volume dialed up, deliberately drowning out my existence. They weren't joking. The people I called blood had locked me out of the very sanctuary my paychecks kept afloat, discarding me like trash on the welcome mat. I slid down the wall, the grimy tiles biting through my thin uniform. I am Monica Hale, 28, the eternal beast of burden. For years, I was the loyal workhorse pulling a cart full of parasites. When my father's business crumbled into ruin, I picked up the slack. When Eleanor needed to maintain her luxurious facade while pretending to work, I took the graveyard shifts. I traded my youth, my sleep, and my future for their mortgage and their survival. They praised my endless sacrifices. I, like an absolute fool, mistook their parasitic greed for love. An hour bled by in the freezing corridor. The building's silence was absolute, save for the harsh, buzzing hum of the flickering fluorescent light above. I closed my eyes, desperately trying to rationalize this cruelty as just another twisted family spat that morning light would fix. Then, the television muted. New voices crept out from under the door gap. They weren't muffled by anger, they were lowered by secrecy. "I'm telling you, the plan is flawless," Eleanor purred. It was a calm, calculating tone I had never heard, the voice of a predator plotting a kill. My father's baritone trembled with pathetic hesitation. "Are you absolutely certain she doesn't know about the account?" Account? My eyes snapped open. The word hit me like a physical blow to the ribs. Eleanor chuckled, a wet, ugly sound. "Monica, please. She's too busy playing the exhausted martyr to check a bank statement. She has no idea what Grandpa actually left her in that trust." "But the transfer," my mother whispered, her voice shaking with cowardice, not guilt. "If the bank flags the withdrawal?" "They won't," Eleanor snapped, venomous and precise. "The moment the money is routed, we report the theft. Who's the only one working nights? Who's the only one wandering the city at ungodly hours? We frame it as a mugging, or her own desperate embezzlement. The police will eat it up. The story writes itself." The hallway didn't just feel colder. The oxygen itself turned to freezing glass in my lungs. I remained perfectly still on the filthy floor. The crippling exhaustion that had weighed me down just seconds ago evaporated, burned away by something entirely new, something dark, crystalline, and terrifyingly sharp. The locked door wasn't a punishment anymore. It was a revelation. They thought they were locking a helpless victim out in the cold. They didn't realize they had just locked themselves inside with the monster they had just created. I didn't move from the hallway floor for several minutes after the conversation inside finally faded into silence. My back was pressed against the wall, my hands resting loosely on my knees, but my mind was racing in a direction I had never imagined before. Grandpa actually left her. The words echoed through my head like something that had been hidden in plain sight for years. I tried to convince myself I had misunderstood what they said through the door, but the calm certainty in Eleanor's voice made that impossible to ignore. For most of my life, my grandfather had been the only person in the family who spoke to me like I was capable of building my own future. When I was younger, he used to tell me that hard work meant nothing if you allowed people to control the rewards of it. At the time, I thought he was just offering advice the way older people often do. I never imagined those words might have been connected to something real. Inside the apartment, I could hear chairs moving and quiet footsteps crossing the living room. My father's voice drifted faintly through the door again. "Maybe we should slow down. If something goes wrong with the bank—" Eleanor sounded impatient. "Nothing is going wrong. The authorization forms were already submitted weeks ago. The only thing left is making sure the story makes sense." Authorization forms, weeks ago. My stomach tightened as the realization spread slowly through me. That meant whatever they were planning hadn't started tonight. Tonight was just the final step. I stood up carefully, trying to avoid making noise in the hallway. The building was still silent, and the dim overhead light cast a pale reflection across the apartment door. For the first time since I moved into that place with my family 3 years earlier, the door looked unfamiliar. It no longer felt like the entrance to my home. It felt like the wall separating me from a conversation I was never supposed to hear. I slipped my phone quietly out of my bag and turned on the voice recorder. I wasn't even sure why I did it at first. Instinct, maybe. Something inside me understood that whatever they were discussing was bigger than a late argument about work schedules. The recorder light blinked softly on the screen as I held the phone close to the door. My mother spoke next, her voice carrying a nervous edge. "But if she checks the account herself—" Eleanor laughed again, quieter this time. "When has Monica ever had time to check anything? She works, she sleeps, she works again. That's the whole reason this works." My father let out a slow breath. "I still don't like involving the police." "We're not involving them," Eleanor replied. "We're just reporting what already happened. By the time anyone asks questions, the money will already be gone, and the only person with access will be Monica." The hallway seemed to shrink around me as those words settled into place. The only person with access will be Monica. My hands tightened slightly around the phone. I realized then that the inheritance they were talking about must have come from Grandpa. I remembered attending the small legal meeting after his funeral 2 years earlier, sitting quietly in a chair while the attorney explained that certain financial matters would be finalized later. At the time, my parents handled all the paperwork and told me it wasn't something I needed to worry about. Apparently, they were right about one thing. I hadn't worried about it. Inside the apartment, Eleanor's voice lowered even further. "All we need is a reason to explain why the money disappeared. Once the bank sees the report, everything points to Monica. She's the one with the account." The recorder in my hand captured every word. For a moment, I closed my eyes and felt the weight of everything pressing against me. The family I had been working overtime to support believed I was predictable enough to frame, reliable enough to sacrifice. When I opened my eyes again, the confusion that filled my mind earlier had begun turning into something sharper. Careful. That was the word Eleanor used. I looked down at the phone screen, confirming the recording was still running, and then slid it quietly back into my bag. The conversation inside the apartment had already revealed more than they realized, but something told me this wasn't the end of it. If their plan depended on me never asking questions, then the first thing I needed to do was start asking them. The hallway light buzzed softly above my head as I stepped away from the door. For the first time that night, being locked outside didn't feel like humiliation anymore. It felt like the moment everything finally started making sense. Morning arrived slowly, the gray light of early dawn creeping through the narrow hallway window where I had spent most of the night sitting against the wall. My neck was stiff, my legs numb from the cold tile floor, but the exhaustion in my body felt distant compared to the sharp clarity in my mind. I hadn't slept. I had spent hours replaying every word I heard through the apartment door, letting the meaning settle into something that no longer felt like a misunderstanding. Around 6:30, the lock finally clicked. The door opened just enough for my mother to step into the hallway. She looked surprised to see me still sitting there, as if she had expected the night to erase the situation completely. Her expression shifted quickly from surprise to irritation. "You're still here?" she asked. I stood up slowly, brushing the dust from my uniform. "You locked the door." My father appeared behind her in the doorway, already dressed for work. He avoided my eyes as he spoke. "You came home late again. We told you this house has rules. Late again. 5 minutes. I looked past them into the apartment where the television was already playing the morning news. Eleanor was sitting at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone, her posture relaxed, almost bored. She didn't look up when I stepped inside. No one mentioned the night before. No one mentioned the locked door. It was as if the entire thing had been a normal family disagreement instead of a deliberate decision to leave me in the hallway all night. I moved quietly to the small sink near the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, letting the cold settle in my throat while I watched the room carefully. Eleanor finally glanced up from her phone. "You look terrible," she said casually. "Maybe if you didn't stay out so late every night, you wouldn't look like that." I leaned against the counter and met her eyes. "Work isn't exactly a party," she shrugged. "Still your choice." The conversation might have ended there if my father hadn't suddenly cleared his throat. "We need to talk about something," he said. The words landed in the room with a strange weight. Eleanor's attention sharpened immediately. My mother folded her arms as if she had been waiting for this moment. "What kind of something?" I asked. My father exchanged a quick glance with Eleanor before continuing. "Your grandfather's inheritance account." For a brief moment, I almost laughed. So this was it. I set the empty glass down slowly on the counter. "What about it?" My mother stepped closer, her voice carrying a mixture of concern and accusation. "The bank contacted us this morning about suspicious activity." Suspicious activity. Eleanor finally put her phone down and turned fully toward me. "They said money was moved from the account late last night," she said. "A large amount." The room became very quiet. I could feel every pair of eyes in the kitchen studying my reaction, waiting for surprise, confusion, guilt, something that would confirm the story they had already decided to believe. I simply stood there. "How much money?" I asked calmly. My father hesitated before answering. "Nearly $80,000. $80,000. I remembered Eleanor's voice through the door hours earlier. "Once the money moves, we report it missing." My mother's gaze hardened slightly. "The bank said the transfer came from the account connected to your name." There it was. The accusation wasn't spoken directly, but it didn't need to be. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, watching me carefully. "You're the only one with access to that account, Monica." I crossed my arms slowly, letting the silence stretch long enough to make them uncomfortable. "And the money disappeared while you were out all night," she added. My father shook his head, trying to sound reasonable. "We're not saying you did anything wrong, but the situation looks complicated." Complicated. I studied each of their faces, noticing details I had ignored for years. The way Eleanor watched me with a faint edge of expectation. The way my mother's expression shifted between concern and calculation. The way my father avoided looking directly at me. They were waiting for something. A confession. An apology. Maybe even panic. Instead, I asked a single question. "When exactly did the bank say the transfer happened?" My mother frowned slightly. "Around midnight." Midnight. I remembered sitting in the hallway outside that very door at midnight, recording the conversation where Eleanor calmly described the plan to accuse me. I felt the phone inside my bag press lightly against my side. Eleanor leaned forward across the counter. "So," she said softly, "do you want to explain what happened?" I looked directly at her and allowed myself a small, quiet smile. "No," I said. "I think I'd rather hear what the bank has to say first." The apartment felt smaller after that conversation, as if the walls themselves had moved a few inches closer together. No one spoke for several seconds after my answer. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly while my mother glanced at my father as though silently asking whether the next step should begin now or later. My father was the first to break the silence. "The bank has already been contacted," he said carefully. "They're reviewing the transfer." I nodded slowly, keeping my voice neutral. "Good." Eleanor leaned forward across the kitchen counter, her fingers tapping lightly against the surface. "You don't seem very surprised that $80,000 disappeared from your account." I met her gaze without looking away. Maybe because I don't believe it did. Her tapping stopped. My mother frowned. The bank confirmed it. Did they? I asked. My father's voice sharpened slightly. Monica, this isn't something to joke about. I'm not joking. The room fell quiet again. I could see the irritation building behind Eleanor's calm expression, the way it always did when a conversation stopped moving in the direction she expected. You're the only one who can access that account, she said. Am I? I asked. Her eyes flashed for a moment before she answered. Yes. I picked up my bag from the chair beside the table and slung the strap over my shoulder. The phone inside it felt heavier than usual, as if it understood how important the recording from last night had suddenly become. Well, I said, then the bank will confirm that soon enough. My mother stepped closer, blocking the hallway that led toward the door. You're not leaving like this, she said. Like what? Like nothing happened. I looked at her for a moment before replying. Something did happen, but I don't think you want to talk about that part. Her expression tightened. What is that supposed to mean? I glanced briefly at Eleanor, who was watching me more carefully now. It means, I said calmly, that if the bank believes $80,000 moved out of my account, then the bank will investigate where it went. My father rubbed his forehead. That's exactly the problem. Investigations involve questions. Then we should let them ask questions, I said. Eleanor pushed her chair back and stood up slowly. You're acting very confident for someone whose account just lost $80,000. I'm acting like someone who knows what's actually in that account. The words hung in the air longer than I expected. Eleanor's expression changed slightly, just enough to reveal the smallest crack in her confidence. What does that mean? She asked. It means I've never withdrawn money from it. That doesn't prove anything. No, I agreed, but the bank records will. My father stepped between us as if trying to keep the conversation from sliding into something worse. We're not accusing anyone, he said. We're just trying to understand what happened. I thought about the conversation I had recorded through the door the night before. Once the money moves, we report it missing. She's the only one working nights. The story writes itself. I felt something inside me settle into place. You're right, I said quietly. We should understand what happened. Eleanor crossed her arms. Then maybe you should call the bank right now. I plan to. My mother's voice softened slightly, almost pleading. Monica, if something went wrong, if you made a mistake transferring money, I didn't. You don't need to be defensive. I'm not defensive. Eleanor laughed under her breath. You're very calm for someone under suspicion. That word again. Suspicion. I looked directly at her. Suspicion usually requires evidence. Her smile faded. I walked toward the front door, stopping only long enough to pull on my jacket. My father watched me carefully, as if trying to read something in my expression that might confirm the story they had already built. Where are you going? He asked. To the bank. Eleanor tilted her head. Why? Because, I said, opening the door, I'd like to hear what actually happened to that $80,000. The hallway outside looked the same as it had the night before, the same flickering light above the same stretch of tile floor where I had sat for hours listening to their plan. But this time I wasn't the one trapped outside the door. I stepped into the corridor and closed the apartment behind me. Inside my bag, the phone recording from the night before waited silently, and for the first time since the accusation started, I realized something important. If Eleanor truly believed the money had disappeared, then the next person the bank questioned wouldn't be me. It would be whoever tried to move it. The bank lobby was quieter than I expected when I stepped inside that morning. A few customers sat in the waiting area while soft music played somewhere overhead, the kind designed to make financial conversations feel calm and ordinary. To everyone else in the room, this was just another weekday. For me, it felt like the place where the truth behind the last 12 hours might finally start to surface. I approached the front desk and explained that I needed to speak with someone about my inheritance account. The employee behind the counter checked my identification and asked me to wait for a financial specialist. Within a few minutes, a man in his early 40s introduced himself as Mr. Carter and led me into a small office with a glass wall overlooking the lobby. "Ms. Hale," he said politely, "how can I help you today?" I sat across from him and folded my hands on the desk. "I was told there was a large transfer from my account late last night." He turned toward his computer and began typing my information into the system. "One moment," he said. The quiet clicking of the keyboard filled the office as he reviewed the account history. I watched his expression carefully, looking for the moment when something unusual might appear on the screen. After a few seconds, he frowned slightly. "That's strange." My pulse tightened just a little. "What is?" He turned the monitor slightly so he could see more clearly. "I'm reviewing the transaction history connected to your trust account, and I'm not seeing any completed transfers in the past 24 hours. I leaned forward. "None?" "No," he said, scrolling slowly through the records. "The account balance hasn't changed." For a moment, I said nothing. $80,000 had supposedly vanished from my account, yet the official records showed no withdrawal at all. Mr. Carter glanced at me again. "Did someone tell you a transfer occurred?" "My family said the bank contacted them this morning." He stopped scrolling. "Contacted them?" "Yes." He leaned back slightly in his chair, considering the situation. "That's unusual," he said. "Our bank only communicates directly with the account holder regarding trust activity." "I'm the account holder." "Yes, you are." He typed a few more commands and opened another section of the account history. "There were," he said slowly, "2 attempted authorization requests submitted recently." I felt my attention sharpen immediately. Attempted? They were requests to add additional authorized users to the trust account. Both were rejected because the documentation didn't meet the legal requirements. When were they submitted? He checked the timestamps. 3 weeks ago, and again 12 days ago. I already knew the answer before asking the next question. "Do the records show who submitted them?" Mr. Carter studied the form details on the screen. "Yes, the requests listed Eleanor Hale as the proposed authorized user." "My sister." I let the silence settle in the room for a moment. "So she tried to gain access," I said quietly. "It appears so," he replied, "but as I mentioned, both requests were denied." "What about the $80,000 transfer?" He shook his head. "There is no record of any transfer leaving this account." I leaned back slowly in the chair, which meant the accusation at home that morning had never been based on real bank information. It had been created. Mr. Carter closed the transaction window and turned fully toward me. "If someone believes funds were stolen, the bank would typically be contacted directly by the account holder. Have you reported a missing transfer?" "No." "Then there is no active investigation connected to your account." I thought about Eleanor's voice through the apartment door the night before. Once the money moves, we report it missing. Except the money had never moved. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, glancing briefly at the recording file saved from the hallway outside the apartment. "Mr. Carter," I said, "if someone tried to report a fraudulent transfer from this account, would the bank verify the transaction history first?" "Absolutely. And if the transfer didn't exist, then the report would be dismissed immediately." A small, slow realization spread through my mind. Eleanor's entire plan depended on the money actually moving. Without that step, the story collapsed before it even started. Mr. Carter looked at me carefully. "Is there something else you'd like me to check?" "Yes," I said. I leaned forward slightly. "Could you print the full account history and the records of those authorization attempts?" He nodded. "Of course." A few minutes later, he handed me a thick stack of printed statements. The balance was untouched. The trust account remained exactly where it had been since my grandfather created it, and the documents clearly listed Eleanor's failed attempts to gain access. I slipped the papers into my bag and stood up. "Thank you," I said. As I walked out of the bank and into the sunlight outside, I realized something important. The money hadn't disappeared, which meant the only thing that had actually happened was the accusation, and that accusation had been made on purpose. I didn't go back to the apartment after leaving the bank. Instead, I walked 3 blocks down the street and turned into the quiet brick building where Daniel Whitaker's law office was located. The sign near the entrance listed several attorneys who specialized in estate planning and financial disputes, the kind of work that suddenly felt much more relevant to my life than it had the week before. The receptionist asked for my name and disappeared briefly down a hallway. A few minutes later, a tall man with silver-streaked hair stepped into the lobby and introduced himself. "Monica Hale?" "Yes, I'm Daniel Whitaker. Come in." His office was simple and organized, shelves lined with legal books and framed certificates. I sat across from his desk and placed the stack of bank documents in front of him before he even asked a question. "I think my family is trying to frame me for stealing from my own inheritance account," I said. He didn't react with surprise. Instead, he opened the folder and began reviewing the printed statements carefully. "Tell me everything from the beginning," he said. So I did. I told him about the night I was locked out of the apartment. I told him about the conversation I overheard through the door and the recording on my phone. I described the accusation at breakfast and the claim that $80,000 had disappeared from the account. Daniel read quietly while I spoke. When I finished, he set the papers down and folded his hands. "The account balance hasn't changed," he said. "No. And your sister attempted to add herself as an authorized user twice." "Yes." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "That tells us a lot already." "About what?" "About motive." I pulled my phone from my bag and placed it on the desk. "There's also a recording." His eyebrow lifted slightly. "From the hallway outside the apartment last night." I pressed play. Eleanor's voice filled the office quietly, explaining how the accusation would work once the money moved and the report was filed. My father's hesitation, my mother's nervous questions, every piece of the conversation that revealed the plan. Daniel listened without interrupting. When the recording ended, the room stayed silent for several seconds. "That," he said finally, "is very useful." "You believe me?" He smiled faintly. "Evidence is much more reliable than belief." He tapped one of the bank statements with his finger. "Your sister attempted to access the trust account and failed. Shortly afterward, she created a story about stolen funds. If that accusation had reached the police before you checked the bank records, the situation could have become complicated very quickly." "But the money never moved." "Exactly." He opened a legal notebook and began writing a few notes. "Sometimes people build a plan assuming no one will check the details." I watched him carefully. "So what happens now?" "That depends on what your sister does next." He slid the bank records back toward me. "If she files an official report claiming the funds were stolen, the bank statements immediately contradict the claim. That could open the door to a fraud investigation. And if she doesn't? Then it becomes a family dispute with very clear documentation." I thought about the breakfast table, the way Eleanor had watched my reaction as if she was waiting for panic. "She thinks the money moved," I said. "Probably." Daniel nodded toward my phone. "And she definitely thinks you don't know about the conversation you recorded." "That's true." He closed the notebook and leaned forward slightly. "In that case, the smartest thing you can do is nothing." "Nothing." "Not yet." He explained it calmly. "If you confront her immediately, she will deny everything and change the story. But if she believes the accusation still works, she may repeat it again in front of witnesses." "Like my parents." "Exactly." He stood and walked to a small cabinet behind his desk, pulling out a folder. "Keep the bank statements. Keep the recording. If your sister continues pushing the story about stolen money, we will have enough evidence to stop it quickly." I took the documents back and slipped them into my bag. "So I just wait?" "For now." I stood up from the chair, feeling the strange calm that had been growing inside me since the bank confirmed the truth. "What if she tries something else?" I asked. Daniel smiled slightly. "People who build plans like this usually think they're smarter than everyone else." "And that's a problem?" "It often is," he said. As I left the office and stepped back onto the sidewalk, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from my mother. "Dinner tonight. We need to talk as a family." I read the message twice. Then I looked down at the folder of documents in my bag and typed a simple reply. I'll be there. Because for the first time since the accusation started, I understood something clearly. If Eleanor wanted to repeat the story again, dinner would be the perfect place for her to do it. The apartment smelled like roasted chicken and garlic when I opened the door that evening, a strangely normal scent for a night that felt anything but normal. The dining table had already been set with 4 plates, glasses filled with water, and the same white cloth my mother usually saved for holidays. For a moment, the scene looked almost peaceful, as if the tension from the past 2 days had simply disappeared. Eleanor was already sitting at the table when I stepped inside. She looked up from her phone and offered a polite smile that felt rehearsed. "Good," she said. "You came." My father stood near the kitchen counter, pretending to adjust the position of a chair. My mother placed a bowl of vegetables in the center of the table and motioned for everyone to sit. "Let's just talk calmly tonight," she said. I took my seat without speaking. The first few minutes passed in forced, normal conversation. My mother asked whether work had been busy. My father mentioned something about the weather changing later in the week. Eleanor quietly cut pieces of chicken on her plate, watching me in short glances that she probably believed I didn't notice. Finally, she set her fork down. "We can't keep pretending everything is normal," she said. My father nodded slowly. "She's right." My mother folded her hands together on the table. "The situation with the money needs to be resolved." There it was again. The accusation. I leaned back slightly in my chair and waited. Eleanor began speaking in the calm, patient tone she always used when she believed she had control of a conversation. "We all know what happened," she said. "But if it was a mistake, this is the moment to fix it." My father looked at me carefully. "If money was transferred from the inheritance account," he said, "it would be better to admit it now before the bank investigation goes further." I felt the folder of documents resting inside my bag beside the chair. "What investigation?" I asked quietly. Eleanor tilted her head. "The one that happens when $80,000 disappears from a trust account. I went to the bank this morning." That sentence changed the air in the room instantly. Eleanor's expression didn't move, but something in her posture stiffened slightly. "Oh," she said. "And what did they tell you?" "That the account balance hasn't changed." The words landed like a dropped glass. My mother frowned immediately. "That can't be right." "That's what the bank records show." Eleanor laughed softly. "So the bank is wrong?" "No." I reached down beside my chair and pulled the folder from my bag, placing it carefully in the center of the table. "These are the official statements." My father leaned forward and opened the folder slowly. Page after page of printed bank records showed the same number repeated at the bottom of each statement. The balance had never moved. My mother stared at the pages in confusion. "But the bank called us this morning," she said. "No," I replied calmly. "They didn't." Eleanor's voice sharpened slightly. "So you're saying we invented the entire situation?" I met her eyes. "I'm saying the bank never reported a missing transfer." She crossed her arms. "Then explain why the money disappeared." "It didn't." My father flipped through the statements again, his expression tightening as he reached the final page. Eleanor leaned forward suddenly. "You're missing the point," she said. "You're the only one with access to that account." "Actually," I said, sliding another document from the folder, "someone else tried to gain access." The paper landed directly in front of her. "Authorization request denied." Her name was printed clearly across the top of the form. The room went silent. My mother looked from the document to Eleanor. "What is this?" Eleanor didn't answer. "It's the bank record of 2 attempts to add Eleanor as an authorized user," I said. "Both requests were rejected." My father's voice was barely above a whisper. "You tried to access the account?" Eleanor pushed the paper away. "That doesn't prove anything." "You're right," I said. I reached into my bag again and pulled out my phone. "This proves something." I pressed play. Her voice filled the dining room exactly as it had filled the hallway the night before. Once the money moves, we report it missing. She's the only one working nights. The story writes itself." The recording ended. No one spoke. My mother stared at Eleanor in disbelief. My father looked down at the table as if the wood grain suddenly demanded his full attention. Eleanor was the only one still moving, her breathing slightly faster now. "You recorded that?" "Yes." Her voice rose slightly. "You were spying on us." "I was sitting in the hallway because you locked the door." That sentence stopped the room again. I gathered the papers back into the folder slowly. "The bank confirmed the account is untouched," I said, "and my attorney already has copies of everything." Eleanor's confidence had vanished completely now. "You went to a lawyer?" "Yes." I stood up from the table. "And if anyone reports that $80,000 was stolen," I added calmly, "the bank records and that recording will explain exactly what really happened." No one tried to stop me as I walked toward the door. The apartment behind me felt strangely quiet, because the story Eleanor planned to tell had just collapsed in front of everyone who needed to hear the truth. The next morning, the apartment was unusually quiet when I woke up. No television noise, no kitchen cabinets opening and closing, no casual conversations drifting down the hallway. The silence felt different from the tension of the previous night. It felt heavier, as if the truth revealed at the dinner table had settled over the entire apartment, like a weight no one knew how to move. I walked into the kitchen and found only my father sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. The folder of bank documents I had left on the counter the night before was gone. He looked up when I entered, but the confident certainty that had filled his voice the previous morning had disappeared. "Your mother took Eleanor to talk somewhere this morning," he said quietly. I nodded and poured a glass of water. Neither of us mentioned the recording. Neither of us mentioned the accusation. For the first time in years, there was nothing left to argue about. After a few minutes, my phone vibrated on the counter. The screen showed a message from Daniel Whitaker asking whether the dinner confrontation had happened. I stepped into the hallway to call him back and briefly explained everything that unfolded the night before. He listened carefully. "So the accusation collapsed in front of everyone," he said. "Yes." "And the bank records were shown." "Yes." Daniel paused for a moment before responding. "In that case, the situation is likely finished. Without evidence of a missing transfer, no bank investigation can continue." "So nothing else happens?" "Legally speaking, no, but I would still keep the documentation and the recording in case the story changes again." I thanked him and ended the call. When I returned to the kitchen, my father had already finished his coffee. He stood up slowly and avoided my eyes as he walked toward the door. "Your grandfather trusted you with that account," he said before leaving. "Maybe he knew something the rest of us didn't." The apartment was silent again after he left. Later that afternoon, my mother sent a short message asking if we could talk privately at a small cafe a few blocks away. When I arrived, she was already sitting at a table near the window, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea that had long since stopped steaming. She looked tired. "Eleanor didn't realize you knew about the trust account," she said quietly. "I figured that out. She thought the money was meant to help the whole family." I sat across from her and waited. "She's been struggling financially for a while," my mother continued. "Debt, credit cards, things she didn't want anyone to know about. And the solution was accusing me of theft?" My mother lowered her eyes. "I'm not defending what she did." The conversation drifted into silence for several seconds. "Trust is a strange thing," I said finally. "It takes years to build and one moment to destroy." She nodded slowly but didn't argue. A few days later, the final confirmation came from the bank. The account remained untouched, and no investigation was necessary because no transfer had ever occurred. The accusation that started everything had simply collapsed under the weight of its own invention. Within a month, I moved into a small apartment across the city. It wasn't large, but it was quiet and completely mine. Daniel helped me place additional legal protections on the trust account so no one else could attempt access again. For the first time since my grandfather passed away, I began thinking about the inheritance not as a responsibility to support everyone else, but as a chance to build something stable for my own future. Sometimes I still think about the hallway outside the apartment door that night, the cold tile floor, the flickering light above me. At the time, it felt like humiliation, like proof that I had somehow failed the people I worked so hard to support. But looking back now, that moment was the beginning of the truth. Because sometimes the moment someone locks you out of their world is the same moment you finally see it clearly. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't fighting loudly, but simply refusing to carry someone else's lies. If you were sitting in that hallway, hearing your own family plan to blame you for something you didn't do, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have confronted them immediately, or waited for the truth to reveal itself the way it did here? I'd really like to hear your thoughts, so share them in the comments below. And if stories like this remind you how powerful honesty and boundaries can be, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Thank you for watching all the way to the end and being part of this community that believes the truth always finds a way to be heard. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.